Hello everybody, this is Dan from Screaming Donkey Woodwork. Join me as I make weird shit out of wood. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we're going to be building a Kotatsu table out of this termite-eaten black walnut slab, and it looks like the termites found this slab delicious, which consequently was also my nickname in college. Actually, it was Captain Delicious, but that's a whole nother story. So I started off flattening this on my CNC machine, and then we have to debark it because there's going to be epoxy in there, and epoxy can only adhere to the wood and not really the bark. Well, I mean, it will adhere to the bark, but eventually that bark is going to come off. So if you want a table to last a lifetime, you have to remove the bark. A lot of people always ask me, like, hey, can't you just leave that on? And the answer is always no, because it's going to come off eventually. And then there's always someone who's like, yeah, but my uncle has one and he left the bark on. Well, that's great for your uncle. But if I'm selling to a customer, I want their table to last. I mean, I guess there's a chance that the bark could stay on there for 15 or 20 years, but do you really want to take that chance that maybe it does come off in 3 or 4 years? So to continue that process, we take the rest of the bark off with a wire wheel that my wife won when she won Miss Pennsylvania. And since we took it outside already to get off all that bark, might as well trim it down to close to the final dimensions. I usually leave it a few inches too big so I have something to work with in case something happens. Spoiler alert, something always happens, so I'll take these words from Cam. Leave the wood as big as you can for as long as you can. So after we got a rough approximation of our table cut out, we took it over to the CNC machine, and my customer ended up deciding on something called the hemp pattern. I gave them, whatever options they wanted to do for this pattern between the tables, and this hemp pattern is something I've seen with a lot of other floating wood tables. Kind of the safe choice, like making sure that, other people have it, it's stylish. And I totally get going with a safe choice, but I'm a little bit more dangerous myself, which you can tell by my lack of safety shoes in my workshop, aka my garage. By all means, don't be stupid like me. If you're doing this similar type of work in your shop, make sure that you are wearing safety shoes. But keep in mind, for me, this is a hobby. And really, when you're watching this, if you really feel like my feet are worth you mentioning, just remember this. Keep your foot prison propaganda to yourself. We have free-range toes here, and we're going to keep it that way. You, on the other hand, are free to wear safety shoes inside your own shop, and I highly recommend that you do. And you can also wear a helmet when you go out to the store, so keep that in mind. So that's my safety tip for the day. If you feel the need to mention my feet on the video, then you need to wear a helmet to the store. So back to our quasi woodwork. So here I am cutting out some strips of some 1/4-inch garbage plywood. And the idea here is when I did the setup on the CNC, I had the spacing accurate. I actually cut both pieces at the same time. So I wanted to keep the spacing the same. And if I glued these strips across, it would keep everything in place so I could work on the table. So I had no idea how I was going to do this. I'd seen other people do small tables with cellophane in the middle or crumpled plastic in the middle, and they poured epoxy on it, but I wanted to do it in a big river. And I knew there was going to be a logistic problem with it because you can't just tape it onto the bottom like that. So this is the idea that I came up with, and that's actually a shower curtain. And the board that I'm putting on there is to provide some separation. One of the things I would change if I had to go back is I would have used a thicker board, and that will become evident to why later on. So I'd never seen anybody do this. I was kind of figuring most of this out on the fly. And for anybody who watches me on my lives, I say repeatedly that this is the hardest table I've ever built, and it was hard just because of this particular river. So apparently I didn't like the shower curtain and I wanted something quite a bit thicker. It's been a few weeks since I did this, so I can't tell you my exact reasoning why, other than I probably was afraid that it was going to rip. All right, so here's the idea. I'm going to put that plastic under there. It's going to be raised up by that wood. And then I'm going to crumple some of the plastic, and then we're going to pour epoxy on that, and the epoxy will take the shape of the crumpled plastic, which means there's no way to build a mold around it. I mean, I could, but it would be kind of pointless because we're just trying to get epoxy on that plastic. So here I'm going to use the same trick that I used to seal up the bottom of my molds. What I do is use tabletop epoxy, and tabletop epoxy is much thicker than the deep pour epoxy, so it doesn't have a tendency to flow everywhere. So I just kind of set the wood on top of the plastic, crumpled the plastic, and made a little bit of walls using some tape going around the table, and then really just started pouring in that tabletop epoxy with the expectation that it would seal between the plastic and the wood. Hindsight being 2020 on this, I actually did get this part right, but the problem is it took me forever to figure this out. So I literally, I think, thought about this for about 12 hours before I actually executed it. I mean, it wasn't 12 hours straight, but it was definitely a lot of on and off thinking for the entire week before I did this pour. As always, I'm using Wisebond products, and I really use them because their deep pour epoxy is the best. And since I'm going to be using their deep pour epoxy, I want to match it up with their tabletop epoxy. And it's not that their tabletop epoxy isn't awesome. It's just that, like when it comes to evaluating epoxies, more of my energy is spent on deep pours than on tabletop epoxies. Most of my tabletop epoxy winds up on the bottoms of my tables, so I don't think I'm the best person to evaluate it, although I have been doing a lot of flood coats lately, so yeah, maybe I can say that, Wisebond Tabletop is a fantastic product. And if you haven't figured it out by now, I do not do the typical black walnut, black epoxy table pours. Everything that I do has to be challenging and interesting to me. And that's not a knock on Cam at all. I love Cam, and I think everything that he has done has been fantastic. So I really aspire to be like him one day on my YouTube. And if you take one look at his channel lately, you will too see that he has moved well beyond just doing black walnut, black epoxy tables. It is, however, still what most customers want. So if I was doing this just to turn a profit, that's what I would be doing. I would turn out as many of those as I could. All right, so I poured my tabletop epoxy in and decided to spread it all out with a bunch of sticks, apparently. If I would have thought this through a little bit more, maybe I would have grabbed a squeegee or something. Even probably using my gloved hands looking at this now probably would have worked a little bit better. How would you have done it? Let me know in the comments, because I'm curious, really. Am I missing something that's really obvious here? So with tabletop epoxy, when you mix it, you get bubbles into it. It doesn't really degas all that well in a degassing chamber. Every time I've ever tried it, it's gone nuclear on me, and that's with several different product types. So you're going to have to hit it with a torch or a heat gun. And with it being on this plastic, I just felt like the heat gun was the safer option. All right, here is a new trick that I learned. So I didn't have any more tabletop epoxy. So I took my deep pour epoxy and I poured it into this large pan and I let it sit out for a day. And it thickened up quite a bit before I poured it into the table. And I just did that to make it thicker so it was less likely to leak. And I liked it so much, I did it one more time. And I waited a day between each pour just so it would get a little bit more firm, but not to the point where it lost the tack and I would lose the chemical bond between the two. So I always kind of knew that this thickening process was possible, but I could never really think of a practical application circumstance where I would actually use it. So it was always kind of in there, but no reason to actually do it. But this, it made perfect sense because I needed the epoxy to be thicker. At the same time, I needed it to be deeper than the 1/4 inch that tabletop epoxy allows. So I cut the ends off again to make a nice flat reference surface for it, and it'll become apparent why I did that in just a minute. But definitely did this using the world's cheapest track saw. That's the Evolution, and I couldn't recommend it any higher. I actually had that track saw for the first kind of 3 years of building tables, and it worked fantastic. It's messy as all hell, but it got the job done. I've since upgraded to the Milwaukee track saw, and I can tell you, light years better, but had I not used it, I would have never known the difference, and I probably still would have been happy with my Evolution. But do not tell my wife that, because as far as she is concerned, that was an absolutely must-have. I needed that tool. So another thing that I found myself liking doing more and more is using these cut saw blades to shape wood up with, and I wanted to put some little islands in this table, so I figured, what better time to pull out that cut saw blade and play with it. It makes a horrendous amount of dust, and it is loud, and It's hot under the mask, but it's just really so much fun to carve that wood away with those blades. And in this particular case, I didn't have to be accurate whatsoever. It didn't have to look like anything. And then I didn't even have to go back and smooth it out or sand it out or make sure it was good for that, because I knew right after this I was going to end up throwing them on the grill and burning them. And if you watch super closely, you will see that the final shapes that ended up going in the table are a little bit different than what we have here. And that's in part to the burning is one part of it. And another real big piece of it is, like, I looked at it, I didn't like the way that they lined up, and I cut some others out and I reburned them. So I started over where it didn't line up the way that I wanted it to. You know what? But the reality of it is like, I will kind of use any excuse that I can get to use the cut saw blade again and to practice my carving skills. And doing like free form carving, I feel like is the best. It takes a little while to get something down with these. I know this shape looks really random, but I have pretty good control over what I get accomplished with them at this point. No, don't get me wrong. I think somebody who does like those chainsaw carvings would totally put me to shame. But you know, I would be better than a guy doing it for their absolute first time ever. All right, now that we got the ends cut off of this, we got to scuff it up so our new epoxy has somewhere to adhere. Strangely enough, deep pour will not adhere to smooth deep pour epoxy, so we scuff it up. It's not as great as the chemical bond we were getting earlier by waiting a day between the pours, but it is still a very tough bond that I've never heard of breaking. And best practice is to clean this up afterward, and what I do is just vacuum and then use some denatured alcohol and wipe it all down. You'll see I use a car attachment to get between some of the cracks here, and that was really my only option. So I'm probably going to overshare a little bit here. I've actually forgot to do this step before, and it didn't make any difference. So the epoxy itself kind of dissolved and disappeared in the new epoxy that was poured on. I wouldn't recommend it because the same reason that if you spill epoxy on your garage floor, if the floor is dusty, it's easier to get off. So I can't imagine that this is the best way to do it, so I would still always clean it off. I really want to do a look at the size of that caulk joke here, but that would be really immature. So we're just going to talk about, now you can see why I cut the sides off, and now I have a good spot for that caulk to adhere to. I use these UHMW strips always for my sidewalls. Everybody always is worried that they're so thin, even like some of my, expert friends, and I put air quotes up when I said expert, because unfortunately now I'm as much of an expert as anyone else is at these tables. But I will say this is not a good illustration of how I actually use these walls all the time. So I never really put hot glue at the bottom like this. This is just for this pour. I had to figure out new ways of doing things. Strangely enough, compared to everyone else's practices, I never ever put caulk on the inside of my molds. But I do recommend that most people do put the caulk on the inside of their molds. And the reason I do it is not because I'm better than you or anything like that. It's my mold process is completely different than everyone else's. So if you watch mine and then you watch someone else's, the greater majority of people do it differently than I do. And I would expect that the majority of you would probably follow what everybody else does. As a matter of fact, whenever anybody asks me how to build a mold, I always point them toward one of Cam's videos so they can watch him do it, because he does it like I would do it if I was only building one or two. But now that I am making so many tables, I came up with a much faster way, but it really only makes financial sense to do it the way that I do it, is if you're making like 10 plus tables. So when it comes to building molds, I told you I was going to throw that wood on the grill. Did you not believe me? So now we're all scuffed up, we got all our wood charred up, and we are ready to do our first real kind of deep pour, but we use that same trick and thicken it up a little bit so it doesn't seep through that silicone. This part was really cool because I could start to see what this table was going to end up looking like. Now's a good time for me to explain what a Kotatsu table is. It's basically a Japanese sit down and eat heated table with a blanket over it. Before I started this project, I had to Google what it was because I had no idea what it was. And this is the image that came up. And you can see basically it's a table that you sit down and eat at that has a blanket around it. Well, the part that they don't show is a little heater that goes underneath it. Apparently, back in the day, lots of Japanese homes didn't have central heating, so this was a way to sit down and have dinner and remain warm. So this table presented a challenge from the very start because typically what you do is remove the top and put the blanket down and then sit underneath it. Well, there's no way you're going to want to lift up an epoxy walnut slab table. But we did find an unconventional way to solve this problem. So you saw me adding the dye, and that was trans tint there. And I pretty much only use trans tint when I'm going for a table that's semi-see-through. And that's because it's consistent, so I know what I'm going to get when I mix it and pour it in is going to be the same as what it will be the next day. A lot of the other dyes, they don't necessarily do that. They change from one day to the next. This here is a vacuum chamber, and I put it in there just to get all the bubbles out. And you can see when I open the valve back up, not all the bubbles go away. They just shrink, so you have to hit it with a torch if you want all of them gone. It's not really necessary, especially with Wisebond, but I do it out of habit at this point, and I really feel like it does mix the epoxy up a little bit more to degas it because all those bubbles rising to the surface kind of make a foam, and I don't know, I might be completely wrong, but I feel like it mixes it more, so I do it by habit now. So finally we get to our deep pour, and what do we do, like 5 pours before we got to this one? So you could tell there was a lot of planning, a lot of stepping through this. And here's the thing, epoxy shrinks as it cures. You always have to flatten a table after you pour it. And then when you pour multiple layers, just think of this. One layer shrinks, then as you go up, that next layer shrinks it a little more. The next layer shrinks it a little more. So multi-layer pours tend to cup your table. And now for the sweet, sweet sounds of demolding. So what do you think of my TikTok famous shirt? I will tell you one thing. Don't buy one of those and don't wear it anywhere because people will stop you and ask you if you're TikTok famous. My wife got it for me when I hit 500,000 subscribers on TikTok. And so I wore it thinking people would treat it like a rock star shirt. Like if I saw someone in a shirt that said rock star, I wouldn't go up to him and be like, hey, are you really a rock star? So I wore it once to this place called Huber's, which is a winery/vineyard near our house, and I noticed when I walked in that these girls were staring at me, and so I was walking through, did my shopping, got to the checkout, and they're like, "Are you really TikTok famous?" And I thought it was just kind of a fluke because like I wouldn't think to even ask somebody what they do based off of what their shirt says. And so I didn't think about it. We went on vacation and we went out for dinner one night in Florida, and probably 5 or 6 people stopped me to ask me if I was really TikTok famous. Now, in general, there's nothing wrong with that, but I am completely terrified of being recognized in public. It's definitely not a level where I would say that I have social anxiety, but I just really don't know what to do or say when people approach me and recognize me. It's more of a social awkward thing than a social anxiety thing for me. It probably is something that I should be working on, so if you do see me in public, feel free to come up and say hi. Just don't be shocked if I stand there and stare at you for a couple of seconds looking kind of weird. One word of warning there, if you do say something like, oh, I love you, I love what you do, I love your show, my wife will look at you and say, barf. To her, my ego is about as big as she ever wants it to be, and she will let you know that. So here, remember how I was saying that you can end up with a whole lot of cupping? Well, we did, and I made the choice to carve down lower into the table than to continue flattening it and risk losing some of those lines in the middle. All right, so we did all that work to make sure that we had those grooves left over by the plastic, and the problem is this one area was not carved down low enough with the flattening bit. So I went back and carved through that hemp pattern using that flattening bit to take off the rest of the wood that was covering the bottom of that hemp pattern. And now we'll go back with some tabletop epoxy, backfill that area that we carved out more, and you will never know it was there. But first we're using the glue gun to make a little dam so the epoxy doesn't pour right into the grooves made by the plastic. I absolutely hated doing this. Even in the moment I hated doing this, and the reason why was because I knew what a pain in the butt it was going to be to pick out all of that glue. And apparently we mixed the epoxy for this on top of our Cthulhu table. You can see the runes right there. Lately I've completely run out of counter space in my shop due to all the pours that we're doing at the same time. There's different tables always in different states all over the place. It looks like I put some blue tint in there, but I probably could have just poured this with clear. Since it's on the bottom of the table, nobody would really see or the differences in the tints, even from the side of the table. The refractive qualities of epoxy make it look flat when you look at it through the top, and even when you get through the top side, it makes everything look flatter, so you wouldn't even get a little line view from it. So here we got our fresh tabletop epoxy poured, and we're just going to go ahead and sand smooth that epoxy that we poured into there, and now we're going to have a nice smooth bottom of the table. That quick little sand made sure that my Evolution track saw had the proper register when we were going down and sizing the table to its final dimensions. So I say this knowing it's a little bit of BS because you're never really at your final dimensions with woodwork until the project is finished. And even then, you may not be at your final dimensions. For all intents and purposes, you're as close as you can get, but when you add finish, it adds a little bit of thickness to it. When you do your sanding, it subtracts a little bit of thickness from it. If the humidity in your shop changes, that table's going to expand a little bit or contract a little bit. I mean, on a table this size, if it were all wood, you could probably get about a 1/4 inch of change in that over the seasons. But with a third of it being epoxy, you're going to get a third less expansion. So if you're watching the screen at all, it may seem like I'm doing the same cut over and over again, and that's because I was, and that's because some of the silicone squeezed between the layers of epoxy, and I just didn't want to remove too much, so I was going about 1/8 of an inch at a time just to see where we were, to see that I removed all the epoxy. And once I did, then I would stop, and then I had to final dimension the table. And at the end, we were pretty much successful. We ended up being 47 3/4 inches, and I promised the customer between 47 and 48 inches. And you saw at the end of the clip that the plug had burned up, so there is absolutely no way to fix that whatsoever. So the only thing to do was to go buy a brand new Milwaukee track saw. Here we're just taking a die grinder and making some of the chip out a little bit bigger, and that way it's easy to fill in with epoxy. The smaller chip out works pretty well if you fill it in with CA glue, but the epoxy looks better on top of the clear epoxy, so we try to do tabletop there, and it adheres better if you use a die grinder and cut it out first. It looks better all the way around, so that's what I'm doing here. I just ran the flattening bit a little bit too fast over this area, so I had a bunch of chip out. It's probably a safe bet here, too, that old cheapskate McGee here was trying to save a few bucks on not replacing his bits inside of his flattening bit. They are more than likely very dull at this point. So here we're mixing up some Wisebond tabletop epoxy, and we're going to go back and backfill all the little holes there. You can see I use that Sharpie to circle them, and that's just because they are really easy to lose track of. I can't tell you how many times I've finished and been like, oh my god, I missed one. These catheter syringes are yet another thing I stole from Cam. He used them, and I have poor dexterity in my hands, so this lets me do 3 points of control. So I can rest my arm on the table and my wrist and then plunge, and I get far greater control using these than I do trying to pour epoxy into a small hole. Now you notice I don't put it right into the hole. I put it around the hole, and then I hit it with the torch, and the torch makes the epoxy thinner, and then it will drizzle into the hole. And that way I'm not putting the epoxy with bubbles in there. And see, even scrapes some out because some of with the bubbles got pushed in there. I want to keep it thin so the bubbles will pop easily. And I use the same technique with the next hole that's up on the left, but the whole time I was eyeing that lighter colored wood around the larger spot. And it's not quite punky wood, but it's really close to being punky wood. So I couldn't just like stick my nail in it, but I definitely could mark it with my nail. I mean, I could mark all the wood with my nail, but I really just thought, you know what, let's put a little bit of epoxy on this, stabilize it, so when I'm sanding it, I don't find some big surprise. And I may be revealing a little bit of a dirty secret here, but I don't think that any of us have really figured out the best solution for this. I've seen a couple of the more popular YouTubers use CA glue and spray it down into there. And I've tried that, and I don't know what I'm doing different than them because I'm using the thin stuff too. I mean, they show themselves putting it on, but you never get a close-up again of that area for the rest of the video. I'm probably a little guilty of that too, not going back and showing like the problem areas that I had throughout the build. And not because they look bad or anything, but they just don't look as good as some of the other areas that you do want to linger on. So I'm going to try to do that in some of my future upcoming videos, show more of like the areas that we repaired and then how they ended up looking in the end. Because very often they don't look bad, but you can tell that there's something that was fixed in that area, right? At least I can. Or, you know what, maybe I shouldn't point it out because these are things that maybe my customers would never even notice except for they watched it on a YouTube video. I don't know. You guys tell me what you think in the comments. I mean, on pretty much any given table, there's at least 20 little fixes that you have to do on it to get things as close to perfect as possible, but it's never perfect, right? We only can strive for perfection. We never really can actually achieve it. So that's what I'll have to settle for here. I'll have to settle for this is going to stabilize my punky wood a little bit, but may not look the greatest in the end. But it still won't look bad. So there's an upcoming shot that will show you, here it is, exactly when I fell in love with doing these epoxy slabs. I was doing a very similar thing, and you see how you could see into the table right there, and then you could see the wood grain there. I did like a close-up shot of that. I mean, it was mesmerizing to me. It's one of the coolest things to see is to be able to have that perfectly clear section right next to your wood, and from that point on, totally hooked. One of my very first videos is showing something like that where you could see inside the table where you poured the tabletop epoxy. So this represents an area that we can get almost perfect, and the deep pour epoxy sink into the larger part of the crack. That crack is already stabilized. But here when we flattened, the very end of that crack opened up a little bit because not all that epoxy sunk into it. So we fill it again with the tabletop to smooth it out and make it even. And while we're doing that, we go back and fill in all those little holes that we made earlier. And you can see the bubbles that are coming out of it as the epoxy seeps more and more into it. So I just keep a heavy layer on there, knowing that I can pretty much sand all of this off later. I used to do more of a combination of scraping and sanding when I was taking off tabletop epoxy, but now with that 3M sander that I have, I mean, it burns through it so quick. By the time I got a scraper over there, I'd be done with it. And this here is zoomed in quite a bit and sped up. So like with my naked eye, I can see something is going on. Like I could see bubbles popping, but those little tiny micro bubbles that you guys get to see with the camera now, I really don't get to see those with my eye while we're doing it. And back on this area here, again, just, isn't that not like one of the coolest things to see? This just shows you how quickly that 3M sander burns through this and how quickly I can finish cleaning this up and how close to perfect we actually get with that area. So it was pretty jacked up, but at the end, you couldn't even notice that it was there. As a matter of fact, on the finished product, I had to kind of really look for it to see exactly where it was before. As fun as the 20,000 pieces of sanding, filling it with CA glue, wiping off are, we have the luxury of being able to fast forward through that. But do realize this is half of the work of it. So half of all of the work that we did is being shown in this last couple of minutes of video here. And really here, we're only getting it to 150 grit. And we found a knot on the side, so one more mix of the tabletop epoxy, and we have to do this pour and just let it sit like that overnight before we can finish everything. A quick 16 hours later, we got to the portion where we start to wet sand everything and started with the bottom, just getting it nice and smooth, get it all ready for buffing. My progression through sandpaper grits is 80, 150, 240, 320, 400, 600, 800, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, and then I go to the 3M heavy and then go to the 3M machine polish. grits 400 through 2000 are all wet sanded. I use a wool pad to apply the 3M heavy, and I use a foam pad to apply the machine polish. Yeah, and after that's done, it leaves a, well, I know it looks like I've been making a Jackson Pollock painting here. I put some Ardex on there, and I put way too much on. I'm like, I'll just go with it. And you'll notice here we have to clean out all the grain using a spray bottle. And it wasn't just because I put that much on. I mean, it definitely made the job harder, but you have to do this anyway. So this is how you get the polish out of the wood grain, as you spray it out with water. Becca, my shop helper, keeps trying to tell me that I need to use a pressure washer, but I am terrified that I'm going to push water into the wood grain. So I haven't done that yet, but I will be running tests on that eventually, because it's a lot of spraying, and by the time you finish a table this size, both of your hands are cramped. And here we are on the big shot where we finally get to polish the top of the table and really see those cool pattern lines that were left by our plastic. This was by far the hardest table that I've ever done. I don't show it in the video, but we went back and repolished this thing 3 times. There was just, a couple of errors that we made for one thing, and there were just really problems working through it. The table was not always cooperating with us. I had to reflatten it in the beginning. I didn't show all that just because the video would have taken forever to do those things. But I'm not trying to cover up my screw-ups. There were plenty of them. There's actually a fly in this table too, and if you go back and check my TikTok videos, we put a nice big close-up of the fly. We explained how we talked to the customer about the fly and told them that we would carve it out for them, and they were like, nope, leave it in. We think it'll be cool. But all those are normal problems. That's not what made this the hardest table I've ever done. What made it the hardest table I've ever done was just really figuring out how to make it work and the amount of compromise that I had to do to get the end product that I wanted to get. It was a little emotionally taxing because you see how it's nice and flat there in the center? Like, I did not want that to be flat underneath. I didn't want it to be like that. But at the end of the day, I had to accept what I had to work with there. So I still am very happy with what the results were. But if I were to do it again, and I definitely want to do this technique again, I have a bunch of ideas in how I could do it better. All right, so we got a table. It all looks pretty good. Even after these shots, we buffed it one more time because you can see some of the not evenness on it right now. So right before this, you probably saw the brief clip of Barracuda putting on the Rubio. Rubio's fantastic. You wipe it on, 15 minutes later, you wipe it off. But it leaves a matte finish. So one way to not have a matte finish is to put on a nano coat. In this case, I'm using carbon method. There are some major advantages to using a nano coat, and one of them is sheen. So you can see that it's a whole lot more shiny when you use it. It's also going to protect the table very well. So I like the way it looks. I like the added protection that it adds, but on a table this size, you're looking at a significant investment in time and money. You're looking about $60 or $75 in materials for the nano coating for the ones that I have used, and you're looking at about a 4-hour period of time to do it for a table that size. But in the end, it is well worth it, and I do highly recommend it. Okay, so anybody who watched this build on TikTok knows what happens here. There was some drama. So I went to another creator to make some legs for me, and he did not ship them the best. I'm not going to rehash the whole story, but let's just say I got the legs. They were not well put together for the crate that they were in, and basically I had to end up remaking them. I did, however, learn a very valuable lesson from some of the younger generation TikTokers. Apparently, I was serving tea, and I brought the receipts. It did take me about a day to remake them, and I used some of the wood that he sent for the skirt, which was a really, actually pretty decent spalted maple. So this still had to ship a few states away, and I wanted to make sure the same thing didn't happen, that I assembled it and it broke in assembly. So I settled on putting it together with some dominoes and with some pocket hole screws. I got more than a few comments on how pocket hole screws are unacceptable to use in furniture whatsoever. So I'm barely a woodworker, but I'm going to explain the rationale here. So I sent glue with it and put the dominoes in with it when I sent it. Really, the pocket hole screws were just act as clamps. All of the strength of this joint is going to come from the wood glue and the dominoes. And yes, sure, there are some pocket holes in spots where no one will ever be able to see them except for the people who are looking at the ugly heater that is under the table. But it is a sacrifice I made on behalf of my customer that they are going to have to live with. Terrible angled holes that no one will ever see, with zero sacrifice to strength. To hold the top on, we're going to use some very simple figure 8 connectors, but this is also how that blanket is going to be able to be installed. All right, so with those little standoffs, then the customer will get a blanket with a hole in it that either has a drawstring or elastic around it. And because the standoffs are there, the blanket will have a nice little place to nest between the tabletop and the legs. Note to self here, do not try to do this again on top of UHMW. You can see Beck and I were playing a little bit of slip and slide there, getting that tabletop on, and we're just really lining it up so we can put the holes in that go at the bottom of those figure 8 connectors. But as you can see, I am a measure 20 times person and then drill the hole. The best tip that I can give here is to use a metric tape measure here, and that's just because it's easier to do the math on it. So here's what our final product ended up looking like before we put it in a crate instead of in a bunch of boxes taped together. And just like everybody else, I completely lined the inside of that crate with the Owens Corning insulation board. I just really end up hoping that the customer likes it, and I think it turned out pretty well. The customer called me, told me how much they loved it, so we're pretty sure that they liked it. But if there's anything that you saw in any part of this video that I could have done better, I'm definitely going to do this technique again. So I read all the comments. I don't always have the time to comment back to it, but I do read all of them. So if you have any tips or tricks that I could use to make this easier on myself in the next go round, please let me know. Until I see you the next time, get weird with wood.